You're listening to On Shifting Ground from Commonwealth Club World Affairs and KQED. I'm Ray Suarez.
These are the images rocking the Middle East this morning. The charred remains of a helicopter, its tail partially intact. News that rescuers who took hours to reach the remote site found only wreckage and the bodies of the dead.
Iranian President Ebrahim Raisi and Foreign Minister Hossein Amir Abdullahian were killed May 19th in a helicopter crash. The news has been met in some places by grief, in others by celebration. Raisi was elected in 2021 in a vote that saw the lowest percentage turnout in the Islamic Republic's history, after major opposition candidates were disqualified from taking part. His death raises questions about the future of Iran, and because of the Islamic Republic's assertiveness on the world stage, about the whole Middle East. Joining me to talk about the death of President Raisi is Trita Parsi. He's a founder of the National Iranian American Council and executive vice president of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Parsi's latest book, Losing an Enemy, Obama, Iran, and the Triumph of Diplomacy, reveals the behind-the-scenes story of the nuclear deal with Iran. Trita Parsi, welcome back to On Shifting Ground.
Great to be with you.
Well, it's been interesting listening to the flood of reporting on the death of the Iranian president because it's taken on some very distinctively different shadings. There's the, oh, sure, big name, big office, but not really that important in and of himself school, and the hated hardline butcher of Tehran school. There's team holding our breath to see what happens next, and team not really going to make that much difference in the final analysis. And they all assemble and stack in different configurations in the coverage. Where do you come down?
Well, on the issue of whether this is going to make a huge difference, I think we have to recognize that Iranian presidents can matter depending on the presidents. But Raisi was selected precisely because he doesn't matter, precisely because he doesn't have much creativity, doesn't have any opinions of his own, and essentially would be a pliant follower of the supreme leader. This has shifted the power much more into the supreme leader's side, and he didn't have a president in Raisi that was challenging the supreme leader. But other presidents have, and as a result, the institution of the presidency can be important. But in this specific case, he's not going to leave much of a void. The area in which this actually could have had some significant implications in the short term was if there was any evidence that there was foul play at hand. But that doesn't appear to be the case. And as a result, I'm not expecting any particular changes. It's going to be a challenge for the regime when it comes to the upcoming elections. But the bigger challenge is probably going to be how to handle the succession once the supreme leader dies, particularly mindful of the fact that there are strong indications that Raisi was being groomed for that position.
Well, they are quickly going to have another presidential election. As you mentioned, the supreme leader, the Islamic Revolution's leading cleric, plays a role going back to when Ayatollah Khomeini returned to Iran from exile. Is he, whoever it is, currently Ali Khamenei, not only the real power, but in this case, should we be looking at that job for coming big changes in Iran, not the presidency?
Absolutely, because the supreme leader is not supreme in the sense that he can make whatever decision he wants. This is not Saddam Hussein's Iraq or Gaddafi's Libya, but he is the most influential person, and it is the most influential institution within the system of the Islamic Republic. Moreover, he's there for life. So this is not a 4-year or an 8-year period. The next supreme leader, depending on his or her age, is likely going to be the supreme leader for the next 40 years. That obviously makes a huge difference. The current supreme leader has been in place since 1989. He has seen American presidents come and go. And the next one is likely going to be there for a similar type of a period, unless, of course, the Islamic Republic falls. So who that person is far more influential and is far more decisive when it comes to the direction Iran goes in its foreign policy, as well as the direction it goes in its domestic policies.
You mentioned that supreme leaders and presidents haven't always seen eye to eye. Give us some more recent examples so people can kind of remember who's been in charge in the recent past.
Well, first of all, when we look at the Khatami years, this is Mohammad Khatami, who was elected in 1997 in a landslide victory, took the Iranian establishment by surprise. He was clearly seen as not only a much more moderate, reformist persona, but also one that was anti-establishment, essentially. He pushed for an opening with the United States. He didn't push hard enough in the sense of really challenging the supreme leader. And back then, the supreme leader was not in as strong of a position as he became later on. But it was definitely a nuisance, and you could clearly see that the establishment inside of Iran wanted to go in two different directions. During the Ahmadinejad years, this is something that people oftentimes forget. Because, Ahmadinejad obviously was a very hard-line and conservative person, did not mean, however, that he was on the same page as Khamenei. So, for instance, Ahmadinejad did several times reach out to the United States in perhaps clownish ways, but in manners that was not coordinated with the supreme leader. The supreme leader essentially expected that there would not be any type of initiative towards the United States without his approval. But Ahmadinejad sent that 18-page long letter to George Bush without running it by the supreme leader. And their tensions became so intense towards the end of Ahmadinejad's second term, in which at one point Ahmadinejad refused to go to his office for 10 days. He was essentially sitting at home sulking because of a difference between him and the supreme leader. Obviously, the supreme leader won that fight because Ahmadinejad had failed to build a constituency of his own. He was essentially in office because of the supreme leader's constituency. And then, of course, you have the situation between Rouhani and the supreme leader in the previous years, in which Rouhani managed to push and convince the supreme leader to go along with the negotiations with the United States and eventually the nuclear deal. I'm not convinced that Khamenei was necessarily entirely opposed to it, but in the absence of that push from Rouhani, he probably would not have gone for it.
Well, there have been days of mourning in Iran for the late President Raisi. Can he be said to be merely a supporter, a symbol, a figurehead in Iran's role in competitions from Gaza to Iraq, alignment with Russia and China, or was he a significant player in all of them?
So there's some significant changes that have taken place in the last couple of years, which are to a certain extent driven by internal factors, but I would say to even larger extent driven by broader global geopolitical trends. We have seen a significant shift of power and influence shifting from the West, not only towards the East and China, but also to the global South. This has then coincided with a period in which after Trump left the JCPOA and Biden failed to go back into it, the Iranians concluded that they simply cannot rely on any sustained sanctions relief from the West, and their strategy changed. Instead of seeking to lift sanctions, they were going to insulate themselves from sanctions, and they would do so by shifting east and shifting towards the global South and their immediate neighborhood. So improving relations with Saudi Arabia, trying to normalize with Egypt, joining the BRICS, a huge step, as well as the SCO. All of this happened under Raisi. However, I have to say, I'm not seeing any clear evidence at all that he was a driving force. He was a manager. He was implementing the policies that others were setting. And even in that implementation, I'm not convinced that he necessarily was that crucial. But this is exactly what the conservative establishment wanted. A president that would give them no headaches and essentially would follow orders pliantly. And that's part of the reason why they're quite upset that they've lost him now.
That helicopter crash comes at a particularly poignant time in the life of Iran. In the top echelons of Hamas, the Houthis, Hezbollah, in Damascus and Baghdad, did they just lose an important friend?
No, because, again, precisely because of the fact that Raisi wasn't that critical of a player, I don't see any particular change there. Now, if Iran ends up in some sort of a crisis as a result of this, the elections don't go well, or other factors that brings a degree of paralysis in the government, then I can see a change in the dynamic in Iran's relations with some of its militias that it is supporting, Iraqi and Syrian militias. And that could have an impact on the United States because many of those militias want to continue to attack U.S. troops and drive them out of Iraq and Syria. The Iranians have actually held them back, partly because of pressure from the United States and negotiations secretly between the U.S. and Iran. So there is a scenario in which, in that case, these militias would actually restart their attacks on U.S. troops. That would obviously be very problematic for the United States and the Biden administration. But other than that, I think it's not Raisi and his absence that is particularly important in that equation. It's actually the foreign minister, Hossein Amir Abdullahian, who is a fluent Arabic speaker, had spent a lot of time in the Arab world, had developed pretty good relations with a lot of Arab foreign ministers and leaders, and actually had played an important role in Iran's strategy of really improving relations with the Arab states for many reasons. One of them as an alternative to sanctions relief, improving relations with the immediate neighborhood and trading with them in a manner that bypasses the US dollar.
Not long after Raisi's death in the crash was acknowledged and confirmed by the government, Hamas released a public statement scolding Gazans who openly celebrated the president's death, and even said an attempt would be made to identify and punish them. Does that mean some portions of Gazans are soured on Hamas and see a direct connection to Tehran?
I don't think there's any doubt that there's probably quite a bit of Gazans who are soured on Hamas. But I think this has less to do with that and more to do with Iran's role in supporting the Assad regime in Syria and its brutal clamping down of primarily Sunni Muslims in the opposition to Assad. Iran's standing in the Arab world is actually quite high, particularly under the Ahmadinejad government, in which a lot of frustration in the Arab street with the United States and Israel benefited Iran, particularly Ahmadinejad's very bombastic style against the US. But then it completely collapsed because of Iran's support for Assad in Syria. And I think what we saw there was remnants of that. A lot of Arabs in the region who still hold Iran responsible, which is not entirely untrue, of course, for the many crimes that Assad has committed.
Now, granted, of course, you and I are both trying to figure this out from outside looking in, but at the meeting of Israel's Unity War Cabinet, what do you think the calculus is there with the death of Raisi and the foreign minister?
I think they recognize that Raisi wasn't a particularly decisive person. I think the changes in the foreign ministry, however, may be interesting them more. And of course, there may be some temptations, and there's some voices there who have said that this is an opportunity for Israel to escalate matters with Iran, mindful of the crisis the Iranians are dealing with and the potential vulnerability that they have right now. But I think more than anything else, the episode of the last month when the Israelis first struck the Iranian embassy or consulate in Damascus, the Iranians responded with a barrage of missiles, 7 of which actually went through the Israeli air defenses. And then the Biden administration put a lot of pressure on Israel not to retaliate in any significant manner, which the Israelis eventually abided by. I think the message was very clear. Biden has been extremely forgiving and supporting of Israel despite the war crimes that it is committing in Gaza. But he kind of draw the red line, not at the slaughter in Gaza, but at any larger war between Israel and Iran or Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon that truly could lead to a regional war that would drag the U.S. into it. And it's quite clear that the Israelis also recognize that they're very dependent on the United States. If the United States ends the arms shipments right now, the Israelis cannot sustain this war, which meant that when the president was serious about a red line and said, you can't go in that direction, the Israelis had to abide by it. Now, that also suggests that if Biden wants to be serious about ending the war in Gaza and reach a ceasefire, I think he absolutely has the capacity to do so.
It sounds like you think Joe Biden did Israel a favor in requesting an end to the back and forth.
First of all, he did Israel a massive favor because the United States played a critical role in shooting down the Iranian missiles and drones. The majority of them were actually shot down by the U.S. at the cost of roughly $1.3 billion over the course of 24 hours. But then when it came to stopping the larger war, I do believe that that was a favor to Israel. But more than anything else, this was the president acting in the U.S.'s own self-interest. It is in the interest of the United States to avoid that war. It is also, in my view, in the interest of the United States to end the current war in Gaza. And I differ with the president on his approach to that. But I also think that what happened there showed that the Iranians actually have a capacity of striking Israel. Despite billions of dollars of investment in the Iron Dome, in the Arrow 2, in the Patriot missile system, and David Sling, and despite all of the support from the United States, the UK, France, and Jordan, 7 ballistic missiles from Iran nevertheless managed to get through all of these defenses and strike Israel in 2 important bases that they have. Imagine now if there was actually a full-scale war between Iran and Israel without the 72 hours heads up that the US and Israel was given deliberately by the Iranians, and that the Iranians actually would use their full force, including Hezbollah, then I think Israel would be tremendously vulnerable. It is not a war that Israel necessarily would lose, but it's a war that would cost it tremendously.
And cost Iran as well, no?
Of course,
I mean, it sounds like at the time of the back and forth between Israel and Iran, there was a lot of conclusion that Iran could have done a great deal more damage in Israel and chose not to, rather chose to signal that it could attack Israel at will, but pulled its punch, you might say.
Both Iran and then later on Israel pulled their punches. Iran, because of its desire not to escalate, it did not want to have a full-scale confrontation with Israel. And Israel, because Biden pressured them into not escalating further. And I think this was an important lesson, because the change today compared to prior to April 1st, when the Israelis first struck the Iranian embassy, is that there's actually a different balance of terror between Iran and Israel. No one had any doubt that Israel could strike Iran. There was no surprise in that. The surprise is that now we also know that Iran can strike Israel. And if I was in the security establishment of Israel, I would be regretting the strike against the Iranian embassy, because I think it ended up not being a strategic win for the Israelis.
The death of Raisi comes at a time of great restlessness in Iran, and there have been harsh reprisals to even kind of modest pushes back against the government. It's hard from the outside to know how much Raisi was directly involved in the widespread reprisals, executions, violent crackdowns, the use of the state surveillance apparatus on demonstrators and demonstrations. Was this directed from above his head, or when people call him the Butcher of Tehran, is that a legit title for him to wear?
There's legitimacy in that title, but I don't think it has as much to do with the role that he played, and he certainly played a role in the clampdown after the Masa Amini protests, which also was very brutal and deadly as well. But compare it to what happened in 1989, when he was one of the judges that sent up to 5,000 political prisoners to their death. That's where he got the name the Butcher of Tehran, because of the role that he played. Even though he was quite junior, he was on that panel of judges that ordered these deaths. And it was even controversial back then within the regime. One of the most senior Ayatollahs, who was seen as a successor to Ayatollah Khomeini, Ayatollah Montazeri, actually resigned over this issue in protest.
You know, I'm wondering, as I read all the coverage, whether there's a sort of Iranian version of Kremlinology in 2024. People used to watch the May Day parade, and there would be analysis of who was standing where, and they'd talk about what this means for people's role in the pecking order and so on. With the death of Raisi, will we see, not only in the choice of the next president, but who the candidates might be, who's on the short list, different clerical factions arising. So we'll kind of see a little bit. Is it a revelatory moment about the makeup of the ruling clique, you might say?
So for the presidential election, we will see more of what actually is going on inside of the regime. Because obviously it's more transparent and open, even though it is not fair. And particularly with the last few elections, it's been severely manipulated to make sure that the outcome is in the favor of the conservatives. When it comes to replacing the supreme leadership, we will not see much transparency. They will keep that very tightly within the regime. Even people inside the regime will likely not know much about it until the very end, because this is such a sensitive decision. Again, this is going to be decisive for Iran for the next 40 plus years. So they're not going to take any chances of that. People will try to read from a distance, who's standing next to who and who's attending what meetings, etc., exactly as it was with the way we were observing the Kremlin. I am not so sure that we are in a better position to make judgments, however. Compare the knowledge of the United States of Russia during the 1980s to America's knowledge of Iran in 2024. In the 1980s, the United States was producing a large number of experts on Russia, Russian-speaking experts. And there was a clear appreciation of expertise on Russia. It wasn't suspicious in Washington to understand Russia. That is not the situation we've had with Iran for quite some time. First of all, we're producing a very, very small number of people who know and understand Persian. We have very little access to Iran. And on top of that, I would say that understanding Iran is not necessarily helpful to you in Washington, D.C. There is a suspiciousness towards those who actually have expertise on the country.
Not valued, but vital, isn't it?
Oh, I would certainly agree that it is vital. Now, of course, Iran is not an existential threat to the United States as the Soviet Union was. The stakes may not be as high compared to what it was during the Cold War. But we have also seen how our failure to read and understand Iran has led us to a long series of erroneous policy decisions in the Middle East that have been tremendously costly to the United States. So even though it's not lethal, or it's at least not existential, it nevertheless has been very problematic. We gained expertise incidentally, and I saw it firsthand during the JCPOA negotiations, because then you had so much interaction. And in my book, I write about it. I interviewed almost all of the main American negotiators, and they themselves told me how they started to understand the Iranian system and how politics in Iran worked. Because a lot of the negotiations was, okay, how are you going to sell it to your public and to your political system at home? It was one thing to resolve the nuclear issue itself. It was another thing to also figure out what's the political pathway that allows you to sell it at home and for us to sell it at home. What are the compromises and concessions that you can give and get away with your political system? And which ones are simply impossible for you to sell at home and get away with? That knowledge was tremendously valuable. Unfortunately, most of that knowledge is now outside of the U.S. government again, and it's likely going to be lost.
We've discussed Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. He's 85 years old. The vast majority of Iranians weren't even alive at the time of the Iranian Revolution, were not alive even when he moved into the highest precincts of Iran's power. So for most Iranians, he's been a fixture in their lives. Has he been just reproducing little versions of himself to take over when nature takes its hand?
That certainly has been the plan, to make sure that the direction of the Islamic Republic remains in the hands of hardliners that have the same mindset, the same worldview as Khamenei and the conservatives around him. That's why they have been so threatened by reformists and centrists who had a different perspective, not only on global dynamics, but on how to deal with the West. And you're quite right. Most Iranians have known no other supreme leader than him. And again, that goes back to why that decision, that transition, that succession is going to be so sensitive for the Iranians, because it will have such a decisive impact on the direction of Iran for the next few decades if the Islamic Republic remains in power.
There's parts of this conversation that make me feel very old, because I was already working in the business when the Iranian Revolution happened. I was standing on the tarmac in Algiers when the American hostages got off the plane from Tehran. There's also, along with what was at the time seen as Iran's desire to be respected as one of the countries wearing the mantle of leadership in the Muslim world, whether that's now set aside for a kind of realpolitik which opens the door to buddying up with Caracas. And even though Russia periodically gives its Muslim minorities a really rough ride inside its borders, even though China has terribly persecuted some of its Muslim minorities inside its borders, whether some of that stuff is now put aside for bigger fish to fry.
You know, inconsistency and double standards are inherent to any foreign policy based on ideology. And that is certainly the case of Iran. I would argue that's also the case of the United States. And the Iranians have been pursuing a policy that ostensibly is ideological, and it certainly does have a very critical ideological component, but it's always given way for real political calculations. That was even clear during the 1980s. I mean, you can take, for instance, the secret relations that the Iranians have with the Israelis during the 1980s at the height of their zealousness against Israel. I think what's fascinating today is that because of the change in the global power structure, the global South is more on the minds of the Iranians than just the Arab world or the Muslim world. Without a doubt, they're not going to give up the ambition of trying to be seen as a leader in the Islamic world. But given what's happening right now in Gaza, it's interesting how many people in Washington thought that Iran would actually happily drag itself into that war. And we see 8 months have passed and they have done everything to actually not get directly involved in that war. They've even got criticized publicly by the Houthis and by Iraqi militias who believe that Iran is pulling its punches and is not actually doing what it should be doing based on its ideological proclamations, etc., to help the Gazans right now. And I think that is because when geostrategic imperatives clash with ideological imperatives, almost consistently the Iranians have gone with their geopolitical imperatives. That doesn't mean that they give up the pretense of that ideology. Similarly to us today, we still talk about a rules-based order and human rights as being the basis of our foreign policy, while we are making excuses and enabling war crimes of the Israelis in Gaza. And on top of that, when ICC comes and issues or is about to issue warrants for the leaders of Hamas and Israel, we flat out reject that, almost condemn that, while we were cheering it on when it was done against Putin. So that doesn't mean, those inconsistencies and double standards doesn't mean that the United States is going to give up its rhetoric about human rights. And those double standards, and those are very clear double standards on the Iranian side, are not going to cause them to give up their ideological pretenses.
Dwelling just a little bit more on the ICC warrants, neither Israel nor the United States is a signatory to the enabling documents that created the International Criminal Court. What do these warrants mean, and what do you see in the reaction to them?
That's a very accurate point. Israel is not, the United States is not, neither is Russia nor Ukraine. But when Putin was put on that list and a warrant was issued, the United States pressured South Africa to make sure that they did not allow Putin to attend the BRICS meeting. And the South Africans found a way to avoid inviting Putin because they didn't want to have to deal with the headache of either arresting him or defying the ICC by not arresting him. So the fact that the US and Israel is not a signatory has not prevented the US from claiming that it should be valid in cases where those countries also are not signatories to it. And that also includes Hamas, for instance. What I do think it does, I do think it's very important. This is further isolating Israel. It's further increasing the cost for what the Israelis are doing, not just to Israel, but also to the United States because of the support that the United States is providing Israel in all of this. I think it is going to put additional pressure on the ICJ to not only investigate potential genocide by the Israelis, but also directly call for a ceasefire, which it didn't do. Indirectly it did, but it didn't call for it directly in the previous judgments. And an ICJ ruling is actually binding, and states have to follow it. So is the ICC's ruling. It's just except that the ICC doesn't have the enforcement capacity, is relying on other countries to enforce it. All of this is really undermining the US's global standing because the double standards, as we just talked about, are just so glaring right now. And this is particularly painful, I think, because much of Biden's foreign policy message was that America is back and the Trump years are over, when we were in defiance of international institutions, when we were in defiance of international law, when we completely ignored allies, etc. And to a large extent, I think Biden was very successful in rebuilding American credibility. Whether one agrees with exactly how he handled Ukraine or not, he did manage to reposition the United States as a power that is rejecting an illegal invasion and is pushing back. All of that, I think, has been completely shattered by the support he's given Israel and the vetoes he has issued against ceasefire resolutions at the UN Security Council.
It sounds like between now and November, you see Biden only facing the Middle East and its multiple problems as a net negative.
I do. I think we have passed a point in which Biden himself calculates that if he shifts, he is going to be able to regain some of the votes that he's lost and some standing. I think he calculates that at this point, if he shifts, he's just going to make his own position worse. And as a result, I think what he's hoping for, and perhaps is willing to do, is to just achieve enough calm so that the news cycle is not constantly dominated by the latest thing Israel has done or the latest images of slaughter there, because that is having a devastating impact on critical components of his winning coalition from 2020, particularly African Americans, Muslim Americans, and Gen Z voters. And he really cannot afford to lose them, even a portion of them.
That's Trita Parsi. He's the Executive Vice President of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft and the author of Losing an Enemy, Obama, Iran, and the Triumph of Democracy. Good to talk to you, Trita.
Thank you so much for having me.
You've been listening to On Shifting Ground, produced in partnership with KQED, with funding from listeners like you. Today's episode was produced by Elise Manukian, Adam Ailey, and Andrew Stelzer. Additional production and engineering were provided by Rob Spade. KQED's Jim Bennett is our technical supervisor. Jared Sport is our executive producer. Philip Yun is co-CEO of Commonwealth Club World Affairs. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Ray Suarez. Thanks for listening.